In this lecture, I'm going to be going over the Gospel of John and some of the introductory material that will just be good for you to have on hand before you start reading through this Gospel. So first, who is John? John was one of the 12 disciples, and interestingly, he uses the phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved. You'll find this throughout the gospel, but basically this is a way of referring to himself. And then finally, John is the only apostle to not die a martyr's death. So he actually lived quite a long life, and he was exiled because of his commitment to Jesus, but he did not die as a martyr. Okay, characteristics of John's Gospel. We've talked about how there are the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then you have John. And the Gospel of John is much different than the other three. So, for one thing, the Gospel is much older. It occurs a few more decades after Jesus' life and death compared to the other Gospels. So, like I said, John was not martyred, and he lived a pretty long life. And so it was later in the context of the early church that he wrote his gospel. There are no parables in the gospel, which is quite a change compared to the synoptics, because the synoptics have so many parables that Jesus used in his teaching moments. There's also a shift in the Christology. So John focuses quite a bit on how Jesus is divine, how Jesus is the divine Son of God. So he definitely does focus on showing that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Christ, but he also has more of an emphasis on Jesus being divine than the other three Gospels do. The next one is that the ministry scene, a lot of John's Gospel is centered around Jerusalem, which is not the case for the other three. And then finally, there are a lot of discourses in the Gospel that kind of turn into commentary. So if you remember, think back to some of the other Gospels, like Matthew, for instance, where Matthew bases his Gospel on 5 major teaching moments of Jesus. So John also has discourses of Jesus, but then it kind of switches to his own commentary or his own teaching on what Jesus had to say. And this can be kind of confusing, but basically this just kind of aligns with where the early church was at the time of this gospel. So just keep in mind, John is adding in his commentary to the events that he captures in his gospel. So, as I said, John had a couple of goals. The first was that Jesus of Nazareth is the Jewish Messiah. So, just as we've seen through all of the Gospels so far, how there is this primary message that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah that the people have been waiting for. And we find in John's Gospel that the disciples confess this themselves. And then we also see that Jesus confirms this in his own words. And this is most famously done in Jesus's I am statements. And we'll get into what those were. And then his other primary goal that he emphasizes more than the other Gospels is that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God. So he is divine. He is not only this true King of the Jews that the people have been waiting for, but he is also the fulfillment of the promise in the Old Testament that God will come and be with his people. Okay, just a few themes that you will see throughout the gospel are life, light, and love. And you will see these words show up several times throughout. And then the structure of John, there are a few different ways to look at it, and this, in my mind, is the simplest. So there is a prologue and an epilogue, and then in between those are the book of signs and the book of glory. So we will get into what these signs were, but basically they were signs that Jesus performed or things about Jesus that pointed to him being the Messiah. They were signs of who he truly was. And then the book of glory, basically the second half of the book, is detailing Jesus's last days, his going to Jerusalem, his teachings to his disciples, and then his ascension to glory. And then finally, you have the epilogue. Okay, so the 7 signs. These signs are all pretty much the first half of the book, and they basically are just showing that Jesus is who he says he is as the Messiah, the King of the Jews. So these 7 signs are that he turns water into wine, he heals the official son, makes the lame walk, feeds a multitude of people miraculously, walks on the water, gives sight to the blind, and raises a man from the dead. So keep these in mind as you read through, that these 7 are not just cool stories about things that Jesus did, but more than that, they are signs that are supposed to point the readers to showing who Jesus really is. And then you see this number 7 again. So John records 7 statements of Jesus that are the I am statements. Now, when the Jews heard I am, they're going to be thinking back to when Yahweh says I am in the Old Testament. But here Jesus is equating himself with God, and he goes on to give 7 statements that show his identity. And so he is rooting himself as the Messiah and as divine, as the Son of God. And so those are, I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the gate, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the light, I am the true vine. Okay, so the significance of John's gospel. From a theological perspective, this gospel affirms the priorities that are already in place and established early doctrinal evidence for the divinity of Christ. So John is focused on, basically, because his gospel is later, he is giving arguments for the identity of Jesus. He is saying that Jesus truly did come as a man. He highlights the human aspects of Jesus to show that he truly did come as a human and live a fully human life. But then he also focuses on the divine nature of Jesus to show that he is the Son of God. And so really, John sets the scene for the way that the early church can respond when critics of Jesus and his identity come on the scene. John's gospel is able to show really how this theologically works out of who Jesus is and what he was doing. And then historically, there's significance for John because there gives historical information specifically filling in the gaps between Jesus's baptism and his ministry in Galilee. And so in the synoptic gospels, you kind of have this missing picture of what happens between his baptism and there's a gap there into later on in his ministry. And so John kind of fills in the gaps there for us. And back to the significance of John's gospel from a theological perspective. This is called a Chalcedonian box. And this is just a graphic to show kind of what the early church was facing in terms of critics of who Jesus was. And so this kind of highlights the history of how the early church, how they came to have a solid foundation, a solid idea of who Jesus was. And so John's gospel, as I said, was able to kind of help pave the way for that in helping them helping them define that Jesus was both fully God and fully human, and that he was one person, but he had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. So keep all this in mind as you're reading, and I think you're gonna really enjoy John's Gospel.